Today we're talking about Scarface 1932, and I hope to have time to show you some scenes to compare this version to the 1983 version, which is called a remake. It's not really a remake. There are only a series of specific scenes from Al Pacino's 1983 Scarface, a very popular film in this genre, and the original Scarface. In my opinion, of course, different generation, I like the original Scarface better. There are scenes that I like a lot from Al Pacino's Scarface, but overall I find it excessive in all sorts of ways. Excess is the theme of that film, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily well made. This is interesting. As we said on Tuesday, this is part of a group of 3 films that appeared between 1931 and 1932 that established the basics of the American gangsters genre. And those films are Little Caesar, which we discussed, and Public Enemy with James Cagney, which is about an Irish gangster, and then Scarface. I'll start with the similarities because clearly the similarities were intentional. The film was financed and produced by Howard Hughes. You may have seen the film on him or heard about him. A millionaire of that time, a billionaire by today's standard, who also produced several films. His intention was to make money. It was a big budget movie, cost more than 3 times Little Caesar, and you'll understand why. A lot of scenes, a lot of characters, a lot of extras, a lot of props, including plenty of cars, guns, etc. However, this film was not successful when it was released in 1932. They didn't even break even with the money they made at the box office. Became a classic, okay? So what is that they do to insert themselves into the genre of gangster films? They picked a book, the same way that Little Caesar was based on a successful novel. Of course, they took some liberties with the story, including dropping some things that might have been interesting. They put the character, the protagonist, in the title, right? Scarface is the nickname of Tony Camonte. They started the film with a text that frames the story as a morality tale. In Little Caesar, the initial quote was from the Bible. In here, you find social ethics, a reference to laws and to the government, and in fact, it goes on. There are 3 frames saying, we need to do something. What are you doing? What is the government doing about this? So another similarity has to be a story about morals. Both Little Caesar and Scarface start with a crime, although the crime in here is more elaborate. The shadow you see there is the profile of Tony, who's about to kill Costello, his boss, to help one of Costello's lieutenants, Johnny Lobo, become the new boss. In both movies, you have friendship at the very center of the story. In Little Caesar, it was Rico and his friend and accomplice Joe. In this case, it's Gino Rinaldo, whom you see here in this barbershop reading the newspaper, and the man whose face is under the towel is actually Tony. So this is part of the arc of the development of both characters' stories, their friendship. And of course, their friendship will take them separate ways, right? As you can expect. Both have a sworn enemy. Both protagonists, Little Caesar and Scarface, have a sworn enemy in the police. And it's not so much the police chief that you see here in a very authoritative position, rather is this guy here. And you can read the hatred in his face, his Guarino. Okay? In the novel, at the end, we find out that Tony and Guarino are brothers, are stepbrothers, half-brothers, but this is not included in the story. So, of course, you can anticipate the conclusion, right? The sworn enemy of the evil guy who works for the police will end up being responsible for the attempted arrest and the death of the dangerous criminal. In both stories, the protagonist, who's a lower level member of organized crime, who's trying to rise through the ladders, the levels of the hierarchy of the organization, has a boss who's not really that strong or powerful, right? And this is Johnny Lovell. And you can see the difference in body posture, for example, and then you'll see the difference even in their personalities. So the issue is that in the same way that Sam Vettori was not such a big obstacle for Rico in Little Caesar, Johnny Lovell doesn't have the charismatic power or influence of a successful leader, nor does he have force, power, physical power to remain in charge. Both Rico and Tony Camonte are the kind of criminals who shoot first and argue later, to borrow the sentence, the passage, the line from Rico. In this instance, Tony is trying for the first time a machine gun inside a room. Do not fire a machine gun inside a room. People will get hurt, I promise. And his line, which of course is a memorable one, is, "I will write my name with bullets." Okay, meaning I'll make myself famous by using this amount of force that I have in my hands. But you can see, right, you can see this idea of shooting first and thinking second reflected in his face. It's like a kid. He's all taken, immersed in this experience of firing at no one. He's firing at a wall inside one of their hideouts, which is also not very sensible. Chris?
Just an interesting insight. They've actually started calling that specific gun the Chicago typewriter.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah, that's one of the nicknames. And in this film, like Little Caesar, you find a lot of the jargon that was made popular by the novels and short stories about crime stories. For example, policemen are constantly being referred to by Tony as kidney foot. Where's that kidney foot? Which is jargon for someone who's flat, has a flat foot, right? Like policemen who are walking a lot and end up suffering from flat feet. In both instances, of course, the capo, the boss, is eliminated by the protagonist, and you can see here too the inability to respond to the attack brought forth by Tony in Johnny Lovell's posture and overall demeanor. An easy target, for sure. In both films, the friendship is broken because of a woman. In this case, though, it is Francesca Camonte, Tony's sister. And if you've seen Scarface with Al Pacino, you find the same kind of situation, who falls in love with Gino Rinaldo, Tony's friend. And you can see them here in a scene towards the conclusion of the film. You can see, well, you can't see too many details because of the projector. More details are visible from your computer screen, but they're in this kind of bourgeois environment, right? This is the apartment of a middle class or upper middle class couple, married couple by now. They are married, and clearly she has a positive influence on him, but it's too late in this case. In Little Caesar, the couple, the friend and the woman will manage to go back to regular life. In this case, they won't. In both movies, of course, the protagonist completes its parable, the rise and fall of an evil guy, and it ends up dead. The conclusion you see here, you see on Amazon and in most modern versions, is the original conclusion. However, it is not the conclusion that original, meaning that was edited by the original crew. The people who saw the film in 1932 would see him being hanged, being arrested and then taken to the gallows, right? Because that would reinforce more the idea of a morality play, and because the movie there was a risk of censorship because it was seen as a glorification of crime, an excessive glorification of crime. In both instances, if you remember in Little Caesar, at the end of the film, there is this symbolic background when Little Caesar is being killed with a billboard advertising the new show of Olga and Joe, who've made it as professional dancers. In here too, towards the end, the next to last frame is a sign that says the world is yours, and this is the third time that the sign appears in the film, and of course it's ironic. It's ironic because the film is about a territorial war for the control of Chicago between the north side controlled by the Irish gangsters, the south side controlled by the Italian gangsters, right? And Tony's ambition is to control everything to the very end. He's dreaming of controlling both the north side and the south side, while the police is outside in droves, and he's alone with Cesca inside the house, right? So another symbolic element that reminds you that that there is a lesson to this story. What makes this film in some ways even better than Little Caesar, which was a tight, efficient little film, but a little film. This is more ambitious, a more modern way of directing the actors in the scenes, a different way of developing the stories through the scenes. But one thing that makes this different is the idea of giving a style to murders, to scenes of murders. That is to say, the idea that when you show someone being killed, it shouldn't be just chronicle, docudrama stuff, but it's visual and it's art. And how do you make that? In this case, they came up with this idea that later on, towards the end of the 20th century, became incredibly popular, of having a visual trademark that would remind people of murder, and that's the X. And you find the X from the initial credits. Behind every frame, there is an X, and X indicates a hit, that somebody has been X'd, that somebody has been eliminated. And therefore, through the movie, whenever someone is about to kill them, although not 100% of the time, but it's kind of an Easter egg hunt. You have to really look carefully, but in most instances, when someone is about to be killed, is being killed, or after they're killed, or all three of the situations, you see an X somewhere. For example, in this instance, someone is being killed in the hospital, and this, of course, is the kind of situation that will inspire Ford Coppola in The Godfather Part 1. You see the X very clearly marked here. Often is light and shadow that produces an X. But you can also argue, and some have done so, that there is another X in the scene because this guy who's a rival, member of a rival gang, who was about to be killed, to Tony, whose shadow you see here, is here to finish the job. He's also marking an X with the elevated leg and the position of his torso and the rest of his body, right? And I've put a collection here. The movie includes a reference to the famous Valentine's Day massacre. Before the 7 people in the massacre are shot, you see an X marked by these wooden structures near the ceiling of the room. Then the people are gunned down. If you know what happened was that apparently 2 bandits dressed like cops with uniforms of police force stopped 7 gangsters, took them inside the garage, put them against the wall, and they shot them dead. And this became very famous. And right after these characters are killed, you see the X's again, and it has to be multiple X's this time because they've killed multiple people. So it's the process of creating the aesthetics of murder in a way that is completely removed from the chronicle, the realistic depiction of the murder, right? Again, before a shootout in the streets, you see the X over there. O'Hara's Lieutenant Gaffney goes into hiding, and of course, eventually he'll be killed within a scene, in the next scene. And you see how the light is inside this room with the windows blocked, but there is light seeping into the room, and you see how the light is drawing, the light from those crevices is drawing an X. It's even clearer here in this frame, right? There is the X. And to top it all, since Gaffney will be killed at a bowling alley during a game of bowling, right before he's killed, they're about to mark a strike with an X on his bowling card. Here is Tony going to Francesca's apartment, to his sister's apartment, because his mother told him that Francesca has a man, and he's a very jealous guy, and he will kill. In fact, he'll find out that the man is in fact Gino, his friend, and he will kill him. And what apartment is that? Is apartment 10 in Roman numerals. Okay, so right before he opens the door and kills the guy, you see the X, but this is not enough. This is just the preliminary. This is Gino, who's about to be killed, or maybe has received the first shot from Tony, and you see the X drawn by light in the background. But this is just a selection. There are many more. This is the end, where just Tony and his sister are fighting against a large group of police forces, of cops, and Francesca has just been killed by a stray, wounded, and then she'll die soon, injured by a stray bullet, and you see the X in the background, right? And finally, this is the most doubtful. Maybe, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but right before Tony himself is killed, you see an X on the door, and this is Guarino, his arch enemy in the police, who's come to arrest him or kill him if he tries to escape. And I concluded this series of shots with the core element of the X, which is the scar that gives the nickname to the character Scarface. Al Capone himself had scars on the left side of his face. 2 of them were horizontal, so not exactly the same kind of scar, but the scar too is an X, right? So X marks the evil, the consequences of evil, right? One way an easy way to read the film in terms of the connection between the content and the visual, because it's a film, it's not just a story, is to focus on access to spaces and control of spaces, which satisfies both the need to read this film and also the connections to Machiavelli himself. And talking about access and control, of course, we end up talking about intrusions and intruders. Intrusions because there is a territorial war. So people will invade each other's space, rival gangs or enemies within the same organization. And intruders in a larger sense, because don't forget that there is an ethnic component to Tony and his family, and this ethnic component is very strong visually whenever we see Tony's family's house, where his mother and initially his sister live. And therefore, there is also the idea of the immigrant as an intruder into American society. And in terms of the visual relation with the space, like A Bronx Tale, even at the beginning of this film, you start with a corner, with a specific location, with a lamppost, okay? So we know we're in Chicago, we know we're in the south side of Chicago, and right after that, we see the outside of a place, of a cafe, with the name Costello of the guy in the mafia who controls this section of the south side and who will be killed by Tony so that Johnny Lovo can take his place. And at the beginning of the film, we see the outside, which is a public space, right? The sidewalk. And the cafe itself is kind of a public space. However, it's the end of the night, and we see a guy cleaning here, and then this guy takes the sign because they're about to close and brings it inside. And the camera, even here, it's interesting to see when the camera is moving, when the camera is fixed. We follow the guy inside the store, so we gain access to this space as spectators. And once he goes in, this space that would be a public space, a cafe open to every customer, becomes a semi-private space. Not entirely private, because it's still a cafe that will reopen tomorrow, but it becomes a semi-private place. And that's why later we find the camera staying pretty much on this kind of angle with Costello himself and his accomplices talking about what that night's party meant, what their plans for the future are. And this is the guy who will get killed. And I've included a couple of frames with lines because those are the elements of the philosophy of gangsters in general, not just this guy. It applies to Tony as well. What is their goal? It's the American dream, first of all, right? House, automobile, nice girl, right? So we have to recognize this continuity in terms of theme. The American dreams is applied to these characters, only they take shortcuts. They don't want to work towards the American dream. They want it with guns, with contraband, with various rackets. And then something that you find in here, and even more in the remake of 1983 with Al Pacino, excess. Because the American dream then is taken out of its moderation, and it becomes something that is in itself immoral. Because they don't just want to have a house, an automobile, and a nice girl, but they want to have more music, more girls, more everything. That's his plan for the next party. But that's also the quality of his lifestyle, right? More, which becomes the key to read Al Pacino's Scarface, right? Nothing else. This space, which is allegedly controlled by Costello, we realize that Costello has no control over that space. He is not protected by guards. The place is not patrolled by his bodyguards. And we see a shadow coming from the back. So somebody entered from the back door, and this is Tony coming to kill his boss, essentially. so that his next boss can take control of power. The next scene, it takes place in a newspaper's office, and the chief of the desk for the news about the city is talking again about space. This town is up for the grabs. So this scene gives you a sense of what is going on in Chicago during the early 1930s, but also focuses on fights, a war to control the town, the space of the town, namely the north and the south side. Following this scene, we see another one in another semi-private space. Because this is a barber shop, but the only customer is Tony. The barber is one of their accomplices. He'll play a role in the murder of Johnny Lovo. And they're well known in here. When they hear this, the police coming in, the barber will take their guns and put them in a trash can, will cover them with towels, right? This is their place, one of their places, and they're very comfortable in here, right? And this place will be intruded upon, will be invaded by their enemy, the police, but none other than Guarino himself, with a prominent star so that you can recognize what he represents, okay? And you see his aggressive posture, the way he stands over Tony, that he wants to control Tony and the space itself. At the same time, Tony is much more elaborate, complex as a character than Little Caesar, Rico Bandello. For example, you see here, in terms of space, how he ignores Guarino and turns to the other characters, right? He's not even looking at Guarino, who has this bulldog attitude. He's talking to the barber saying, hey, how it looks in the back, right? The air. And he's looking into the mirror, he's looking away from him. Even the body is moving away, inclined in the opposite direction, right? So he's not intimidated, and he continues in this. In fact, he then invades the personal space of Guarino, and does this, he will do it another time or two times. He lights a match to light a cigarette on Guarino's star, right? The sheriff's star. So this time he is invading his own space. There is much more powerful and nuanced dynamics in here. Tony is taken to the police, and there too, he will show his personality. He's not a one-dimensional, monodimensional character, a one-sided character, which in many ways Rico is. He can play with personality, although sometimes he does look like an ape, as a scholar remarked, as I told you on Tuesday, but he has a more complex personality. So he's playing games with the police interrogating him, both in terms of lines and also in terms of body language. Look at his face in here, the inclination of his head. And of course the line that accompanies it, where was I? I was having my beauty sleep while Costello was being killed. And sometimes he'll just resist by staying there and doing nothing, not responding, not reacting, just maintaining his cool during the interrogation. In this case, just smoking the cigarette. And if you are familiar with films from the 1930s and 40s with Humphrey Bogart, Bogart will imitate this style a lot. Paul Muni was the actor. In this case, he didn't do as many films as he could have done. He was a good actor. And then he turns aggressive. He's not afraid to extend his space, right? In this case, he's putting the arm on the desk of the police chief, and notice his aggressive posture, and of course the side of the scar for a reason, clearly, right? There is this confrontation, and the best example of what I was saying about space is when, in the next scene, Tony goes to find Johnny Lovo, who will take Costello's place. And this is Lovo's apartment. This is the living room, right, where you receive guests. And that's the bedroom. But notice that the curtains of the bedrooms are not closed, right? So there is a private space, and that's the only part of the house where Johnny Lovo, will go. He will stay on this side. But then there is a porous situation because the bedroom is accessed by Poppy, who is Johnny Lovo's lover and will become then Tony's lover, the part played by Michelle Pfeiffer, Elvira in Scarface 1983. And once she's there, then there is a conflict clearly between these two areas, right? This is the intimacy and the intimate relationship of Johnny Lovo, but clearly at this point, Tony will do everything in his power to invade that space. He will not physically access the space, but he will talk to her, he will look at her in a certain way, he will make noises, etc. And she will respond indirectly. Right? This is him by the curtains. Johnny is in the bedroom, but is still in communication with Poppy. Right? And in a very overt way, flirting with her. And even though she's complaining at times, she's engaging in this kind of banter with him. And you can see, as I suggested before, that there is something that doesn't work in terms of leadership, that the alleged leader has the authority because he has the title of capo, of boss, after the death of Costello, but it doesn't have neither the personality, the influence or deterrence, nor the physical power to stay in a position of power, of leadership. And you can see how Tony can overpower him. Right? And the same is true for the 1983 version. Even after Johnny, his boss, has told him that he has to follow his orders, comply with everything he says. Even after Johnny remarked, "That's my girl, that's my woman, yes, she's hot, but she's mine." He says something like, "She's expensive, right? You cannot afford a woman like that." Before leaving, he's not looking at him, Tony's looking at her. So you can see that he has no control over Tony in this very scene. And therefore you know what will happen. In the car with Gino, immediately Tony puts words to what we perceived. That guy is soft, Johnny Lovo is soft, so it can be eliminated easily. And this is the ethnic space of the Camonte family, right? Tony being served wine by his mother, and look, everything from the furniture to the earrings, right? Often when you see Italian women during the films from the 1910s, 20s and 30s, the kind of earrings they have are supposed to be reminiscent of jewelry worn by gypsy, by Roma people. And again, this is like Italy appropriating a space in Chicago. Everything speaks of a different culture, of a different space. This is also the space that needs to be controlled by the patriarchy, right? There is no father to Tony and his sister, therefore he's the oldest man in the family and in control. And you see here chasing a guy who was just hugging and kissing his sister out of the house. And then he sends his sister to her bedroom, right? And from there, she can only communicate with the outside world from the window and through this elaborate ironworks of the balcony outside her window, and she'll start flirting with Gino, who's waiting for Tony outside, and this will be the beginning of their relationship. So she escapes that kind of cage. In terms of intruding a space, Costello has been killed, and they go into the club, they break the glass, and who goes in first is Tony, it's not Johnny Lobo, saying, okay, this is our space now. Now we control this organization. There is some resistance. This guy says to Johnny, are you asking us to follow your orders or telling us? He doesn't recognize, he doesn't feel any authority, any influence, any deterrence coming out of that guy. What does Johnny Lobo do? He just turns to Tony, right? And once again, you see that Tony receives the suggestions, but takes over and takes the leadership. If you look at the expression on his face, this is not someone just complying with orders, just obeying orders. There is more to him. And after that, he will go and punch the guy who said, are you telling us or are you asking us? Then, of course, in terms of intruding, invading a space, they'll go through the south side to all the bars. This is the Prohibition era. Going into these places saying, now, from now on, you're ordering beers from us, and we'll tell you how many barrels of beers each week, and what's the price on that beer, right? And they'll use violence. And that will be Tony's operation. He goes into a hospital to kill someone, and his capo, his boss, is afraid that he'll lose control of his own territory, but in fact, Tony is expanding his operation into the north side, attacking the Irish gangsters. And the message they received back initially is keep out of the north side. Again, a fight for a territory, for a space. At this point, Poppy visits him into his apartment, and they'll both go into his bedroom. There will be nothing, not even a kiss between them, but this sense of intimacy is conveyed by the space they inhabit. They both look out. He says, look at this, and you have this sentence that we now can interpret in terms of space, the world is yours, which to him means he'll be the boss of the city, control the bootlegging operation of the sale of alcohol through the city. Of course, it may have other meanings within a relationship. Another space, the hideout of the Irish gangsters. Tony, will come back into Johnny Lobo's space after an attempted murder and eliminate him, and right after that, he will go to her apartment. And again, he opens the window, they look out, and they have the world is yours. But at this point, he's tired after this long night where they tried to kill him. He had Johnny Lobo killed by Gino. It's clear that he's not fully confident that the war will be theirs, right? And for the first time, you see a kind of idealistic expression in him. You see that it is just a dream that will never come true. He will occupy Johnny Lobo's office, put his name, Antonio Camonte, on the door, and the final intrusion, he will go to the apartment of Francesca, kill Gino, and then realize that they just got married, that he killed his brother-in-law and broke his sister's heart. But it's too late, right? Because his mantra is, shoot first and argue second. He'll be attacked, this is the last scene, in his apartment that has steel shutters and steel doors so that he can close himself. And this is Tony using the machine gun on the police. The police, and he has this delirium will lick them all. The north side, the south side is not only thinking of escaping the siege by the police, but reconquering the whole city with the help of Francesca, because Gino, his friend and right-hand man, has been killed. And this is him, of course, being a morality play. At the very end, he loses his nerve. So Guarino is at the door and he says, don't shoot, I don't have a gun, don't kill me, right? It becomes yellow in the lingo of the time, right? Because in the end, you have to show that a criminal cannot have any moral spine on him. He has to be deep down a coward, right? Only somebody who's really good through and through would behave in a more courageous way. And the very last frame is he is dead on the ground. We've seen the world is yours once again, but the last frame is the police reappropriating the public space after getting rid of the dangerous criminal.